Elijah was 34 years old, enslaved, worked as a blacksmith at Thornhill Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, and carried a deadly secret that no one suspected. Tall, muscular, with hands calloused by work with incandescent metal, he was considered the best blacksmith in the entire region, and capable of forging everything from delicate horseshoes to unbreakable chains that bound other enslaved people. Son of an Ashanti blacksmith captured on the Gold Coast, Elijah had inherited not only the ancestral skill of working iron, but also lethal knowledge about metals, poisons, and the art of transforming tools into deadly weapons. For years he kept this knowledge hidden, living in silence under the brutality of the Deep South slave system, forging the same chains that imprisoned him. Until March of 1856, when the brutal overseer Nathaniel Blackwood, a cruel man who beat enslaved people for pleasure and had already whipped 3 men to death, presented a proposal that seemed like a macabre joke, but was an absolute order. Elijah would be forced to marry the overseer's dwarf daughter, Abigail Blackwood, 22 years old, whom all white men in the region had rejected because of her physical condition. "No decent white man wants her," Nathaniel stated coldly, spitting on the forge floor. "But you'll accept, or I'll hang that old Negro woman you call mother and make you watch." The proposal wasn't just about marriage. It was about absolute humiliation, about transforming Elijah into a spectacle, a living joke that would demonstrate the absolute power of whites over black bodies and destinies. But Nathaniel Blackwood didn't know 3 fundamental things. First, Elijah deeply loved a woman named Ruth, enslaved at the neighboring plantation, with whom he planned to escape via the Underground Railroad. Second, his father had taught him not only to forge iron, but also to create lethal metallurgical poisons, compounds of arsenic, mercury, and lead camouflaged in everyday objects that killed slowly, leaving no obvious traces. Third, forcing a man who masters fire and metal into a grotesque marriage is signing your own death sentence. For 6 months after the forced marriage in April of 1856, Elijah endured public humiliation, the laughter of whites, the pitying looks of other enslaved people. For 6 months he worked at the forge, apparently resigned, forging copper pots, cast iron pans, and pewter cutlery for the big house and for the Blackwood family. For 6 months he meticulously planned the most elaborate and slow revenge ever recorded in slaveholding Mississippi, a series of gradual poisonings through household utensils contaminated with lethal metallic compounds that would attack brains, livers, and kidneys over months, causing progressive agony disguised as natural diseases. On the morning of October 17, 1856, when Nathaniel Blackwood died in violent convulsions after 6 months of mysterious neurological deterioration, vomiting black blood while screaming that hellish demons were burning his entrails, no one suspected the silent blacksmith. When the overseer's wife died 3 days later with the same symptoms, followed by the plantation owner, his wife, the family doctor, and 4 more household members, all frequent users of the kitchen utensils forged by Elijah, the white community entered absolute panic, convinced that a divine plague was punishing Thornhill Plantation. 10 people died in indescribable agony over 7 months. And the blacksmith, whom everyone considered broken and humiliated, observed each death with icy satisfaction, knowing that justice, when it comes by the hands of those who master ancestral fire, burns slower, but burns to ashes. The air in Wilkinson County carried the thick scent of magnolias mixed with the acrid smell of suffering in March of 1856. Thornhill Plantation stretched across 2,300 acres of prime cotton land in southern Mississippi, where the soil was black as midnight and twice as fertile. The plantation was owned by Master Cornelius Thornhill, a man whose wealth was measured not just in acres and bales, but in the 147 human beings he claimed as property. The big house sat on a gentle rise, its white columns visible for miles, a monument to wealth built on the broken backs of those who could never enter through its front door. Elijah had arrived at Thornhill 10 years earlier, purchased at auction in Natchez for the extraordinary sum of $1,800. His father, Kwame, had been legendary among slaveholders in West Africa, an Ashanti master blacksmith whose metalwork was so exquisite that British traders specifically sought him out. But legends mean nothing when men with guns arrive at your village before dawn. Kwame and his 15-year-old son were shackled together in the hull of the slave ship Henrietta Marie for 63 days of hell across the Middle Passage. Of the 327 Africans who boarded in Cape Coast Castle, only 209 survived to see Charleston Harbor. Kwame died 6 years after arriving in America, but not before passing every secret of his craft to his son. He taught Elijah how iron speaks when it's ready to be shaped, how copper holds poison in its green patina, how lead seeps into human bones and slowly drives men mad, how arsenic can be mixed into tin alloys and released gradually through heat and contact. "The whites think we are stupid," Kwame whispered in the Twi language during their final conversation, his lungs destroyed by years of forge smoke. "They think because they can buy our bodies, they own our minds. But knowledge, my son, cannot be chained, and the man who controls fire controls death itself." At 34, Elijah stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall, unusual height for any man of that era, extraordinary for an enslaved one. His shoulders were broad from years of swinging hammers, his forearms thick with muscle and crisscrossed with burn scars that told the story of his profession. His face was handsome, despite the hardships, with high cheekbones that spoke of his Ashanti heritage, deep-set eyes that missed nothing, and a jaw set in permanent determination. He kept his head shaved, practical for work near flames, and wore the simple homespun clothes of a skilled slave: cotton shirt, canvas trousers, leather apron black with soot. The forge where Elijah worked sat 200 yards from the big house, far enough that the constant ringing of hammer on anvil wouldn't disturb the master's leisure, close enough that Elijah remained under observation. It was a substantial structure, 20 feet by 30 feet, built of brick with a high ceiling to vent smoke and heat. Inside, the massive forge dominated one wall, its stone hearth stained black from thousands of fires. Anvils of various sizes stood at different stations, tools hung in precise order on the walls, hammers of every weight, tongs of every configuration, chisels, punches, swages, fullers. In one corner, Elijah kept his most prized possessions, the tools his father had made with his own hands, tools that had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a slave ship. But the forge held secrets. Behind a loose brick in the back wall, Elijah maintained a hidden collection, small glass vials containing powders and liquids whose names only he knew, compounds extracted from minerals found in Mississippi soil, preparations made from plants that grew in the swamps, metal oxides ground to powder so fine they could pass through cloth, acids that could eat through iron given enough time. These were the true inheritance from his father, not just the knowledge of creation, but the knowledge of destruction. Thornhill Plantation operated with the brutal efficiency of a well-run business, which is exactly what it was. Master Cornelius Thornhill had inherited the property from his father in 1838 and immediately implemented modern management techniques he'd learned during a tour of Caribbean sugar plantations. He divided his 147 slaves into strict categories: house servants, who lived in the basement of the big house and were considered the aristocracy of bondage; skilled craftsmen like Elijah, who possessed valuable abilities; field hands who planted and picked cotton from can see to can't see, and children under 10 who performed light tasks and were being trained for their future roles in this machine of human suffering. The hierarchy among the oppressed was itself a form of oppression. House slaves looked down on field slaves. Skilled slaves enjoyed slightly better conditions than those who worked the rows. Light-skinned slaves often received preferential treatment compared to those with darker skin. These divisions were not accidents. They were deliberately engineered by men like Master Thornhill, who understood that enslaved people divided against themselves posed less threat than enslaved people united in rage. Master Cornelius Thornhill was 53 years old in March of 1856, a man who represented the pinnacle of Southern aristocracy. He stood 5 feet and 11 inches tall, with the kind of soft body that comes from never doing physical labor. His face was round and red, perpetually flushed from bourbon consumption and high blood pressure. He wore his brown hair long in the style of the era, though it was thinning on top, and cultivated elaborate sideburns that connected to a carefully groomed moustache. His clothing was always impeccable: fine wool suits custom-tailored in New Orleans, silk cravats imported from France, leather boots made by a German cobbler in Natchez. Cornelius had been educated at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he studied classical literature and developed a taste for philosophy that made him particularly insufferable. He loved to quote Aristotle on natural slavery, convinced that the ancient Greeks had proven what he already believed, that some humans were born to rule and others to serve. He saw himself as a benevolent master, better than the crude overseers and small farmers who managed their human property with obvious cruelty. He never personally whipped anyone. He had men for that. His wife, Prudence Thornhill, was 48, a woman whose beauty had long since been consumed by bitterness and laudanum addiction. Daughter of a Virginia tobacco planter, she had married Cornelius when she was 17, full of romantic notions about plantation life that reality had slowly murdered. She spent her days in a haze of patent medicines and religious mania, convinced that God had ordained slavery as punishment for the curse of Ham. Her cruelties were domestic and intimate, burning house slaves with fireplace pokers when meals displeased her, forcing young girls to kneel on grains of rice for hours as punishment for imagined insolence, pinching and scratching faces that she considered too pretty. But the true architect of daily suffering at Thornhill Plantation was Overseer Nathaniel Blackwood. This man requires detailed examination, for he was the primary catalyst of everything that followed. Nathaniel Blackwood was 41 years old, born to poor whites in the hills of northern Alabama. His father had been a failed farmer who drank himself to death, leaving young Nathaniel to fend for himself at 14. With no land, no education, and no prospects, he had only one commodity to sell: his willingness to brutalize other human beings for wages. He worked his way up through the ranks of plantation overseers, developing a reputation for squeezing maximum labor from enslaved workers through a calculated mixture of violence, psychological torture, and unpredictable mercy that kept people off balance and terrified. He was not a large man, 5 feet and 8 inches, wiry rather than muscular, but he moved with the coiled tension of a snake preparing to strike. His face was narrow and pinched, dominated by pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His hair was the color of straw, always greasy and unkempt. He dressed in practical clothes: rough cotton shirts, canvas pants, heavy boots, and always carried his whip coiled on his belt like a gunslinger carries his weapon. Nathaniel had been overseer at Thornhill for 7 years, managing the daily operations of the plantation with the cold efficiency of a man who viewed human beings as livestock, requiring proper motivation. He rose every day at 4:30 in the morning, drank black coffee strong enough to strip paint, and was in the fields before the first slaves emerged from their quarters. He knew every trick, every form of resistance, every way that enslaved people tried to slow down work or sabotage production. He countered with a system of surveillance, informants, and sudden, savage punishments that kept everyone in line. But Nathaniel's cruelty had a personal edge that went beyond mere business efficiency. He enjoyed it. He smiled when the whip cracked across someone's back. He laughed when he separated families, loading children onto wagons bound for distant auctions while mothers screamed. He took particular pleasure in humiliating men in front of their wives, forcing them to submit, to grovel, to beg, making them smaller in the eyes of the women who loved them. He had killed at least 3 enslaved men during his tenure at Thornhill, though the official count was 0, because it's not legally murder when you own the victim. The first was whipped until his back split open and infection set in. The second was left in the hot box, a metal container the size of a coffin placed in direct sunlight for 3 days during July and came out cooked from the inside. The third simply disappeared after being accused of stealing, and no one asked questions because no one dared. Nathaniel lived in a small house near the overseer's office, a modest structure compared to the big house, but palatial compared to the slave quarters. He had never married, which surprised no one who knew him. What woman would willingly share a bed with such a creature? He lived alone with his bottles and his whip, and his ledgers recording every bale of cotton picked, every pound of labor extracted from human flesh. Until 1848, when his sister died giving birth to her second child, and Nathaniel found himself guardian of a niece and nephew. The nephew was normal, eventually sent to live with relatives in Mobile, but the niece, Abigail, had been born with dwarfism, standing only 3 feet and 9 inches tall as an adult. In the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South, this made her essentially unmarriageable, despite her uncle's position and modest wealth. Abigail Blackwood was 22 years old in March of 1856, a woman trapped between worlds, too white to work in the fields, too defective to marry into respectable society. She had her uncle's pale blue eyes and straw-colored hair, but where his face was hard and cruel, hers showed hints of kindness that life had not yet beaten out of her. She was not ugly. Her features were proportional to her smaller frame, but in a society obsessed with bloodlines and breeding, her condition marked her as unsuitable for continuing any respectable family line. She lived in her uncle's house, functioning essentially as an unpaid housekeeper, cooking his meals and washing his clothes, and living with the knowledge that every young man in 3 counties had looked at her once and looked away forever. She was lonely, desperately lonely, trapped in a small house with a brutal man who saw her as just another burden in a life full of burdens. The driver at Thornhill Plantation was a man named Solomon, 58 years old, who had betrayed his people so thoroughly for so long that he no longer remembered who he had been before. He had been promoted to driver 30 years earlier, given authority over other slaves in exchange for his soul. He carried a short whip and used it freely, always trying to prove to the whites that he was loyal, that he was different, that he deserved to survive. Other slaves hated him with a purity of hatred reserved for traitors. Solomon knew this. He accepted it. Survival required sacrifice, and he had sacrificed his humanity decades ago. The Thornhill Plantation operated within a complex regional economy. Cotton was king in Mississippi in the 1850s, with prices averaging 11 cents per pound, though quality cotton from Delta soil could fetch 15 cents or more in New Orleans. Cornelius Thornhill's plantation produced an average of 400 bales per year, each weighing approximately 450 pounds, generating gross revenues exceeding $80,000 annually. After expenses for supplies, equipment, and overseer salaries, his net profit typically exceeded $40,000, a fortune in an era when a skilled craftsman might earn $300 per year. This wealth was built entirely on stolen labor. The 147 enslaved people at Thornhill represented a capital investment exceeding $200,000 at market prices. They were assets to be maintained and exploited, like expensive equipment that required food instead of oil. When an enslaved person died, it represented a financial loss to be noted in the ledger. When one was born, it represented future profit. The entire system was a carefully calculated conversion of human suffering into cotton bales, and cotton bales into money, and money into the fine suits and imported wines that allowed men like Cornelius Thornhill to consider themselves civilized. The slave quarters at Thornhill consisted of 23 rough cabins arranged in 2 rows, each cabin housing 6 to 8 people in conditions that would be considered inhumane for livestock. The structures were built of pine logs chinked with mud, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked every time it rained. Each cabin had 1 door, no windows, and a single fireplace that provided inadequate heat during Mississippi winters and made the interior unbearable during summers. Families were assigned together when possible, but the concept of privacy did not exist. Multiple generations slept in the same room, adults trying to shield children from sounds and sights that no child should witness. Food was distributed weekly, a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork per adult, supplemented with whatever could be grown in small gardens behind the cabins or caught in the woods during the few hours of free time on Sunday afternoons. It was enough to prevent starvation, but not enough for health. Chronic malnutrition was universal. Children's bellies swelled from protein deficiency. Adults' teeth rotted from lack of proper nutrition, but they had to maintain enough strength to work, so they were fed just enough to keep working until they couldn't, and then they were replaced. Clothing was distributed twice yearly. 2 sets of rough cotton garments for summer, 1 set of wool clothing for winter. Shoes were provided in November and expected to last through March. They never did. By January, most people wrapped their feet in rags to protect against frozen ground. Children under 10 often went naked year-round. The message was clear: you are property, and property receives only what is necessary for operation. Medical care was rudimentary and primarily focused on maintaining productivity. The plantation had no doctor, relying instead on a white doctor from Woodville who visited monthly to examine valuable slaves and prescribed treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. For the enslaved themselves, medical knowledge was passed down through generations. African remedies, Native American herbal treatments, folk wisdom accumulated through centuries of survival. Elderly women served as midwives and healers, their knowledge respected even by some whites who secretly consulted them for ailments that official medicine couldn't cure. Religion provided the only sanctioned form of gathering for enslaved people at Thornhill. Every Sunday morning, they were required to attend services in a simple wooden chapel where a white preacher delivered sermons carefully tailored to reinforce the slave system. Servants, obey your masters, from Ephesians. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, from Colossians. The message was always the same. God ordained your bondage. Rebellion is sin. Obedience brings heavenly reward after death. Just endure, just submit, just accept. But on Sunday evenings, after the whites had eaten their supper and settled in for the night, the enslaved people at Thornhill held their own services deep in the woods beyond the cotton fields. These hush harbors were sacred spaces where spirituals could be sung freely, where preachers spoke in African cadences about Moses leading his people out of Egypt, where the old religion mixed with the new in ways that would have horrified the white preachers. Codes were embedded in everything. Steal away to Jesus meant someone was planning to run. Wade in the water reminded fugitives to use streams to throw off bloodhound trails. Follow the drinking gourd pointed toward the Big Dipper and the North Star, toward freedom. Elijah attended these services regularly. though he was not particularly religious. He went because Ruth was there. Ruth was 31 years old, enslaved at Riverside Plantation, 5 miles east of Thornhill. She worked as a house slave, trusted enough to serve meals in the dining room, invisible enough that white people said things in front of her they shouldn't have. She was beautiful in a way that had brought her nothing but trouble, tall and graceful, with skin the color of honey and eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Her beauty had attracted the attention of the young master at Riverside when she was 16, resulting in 3 years of horror that ended only when the young master's wife discovered the relationship and had Ruth sold. She was purchased by the current owner of Riverside, who kept her as a house servant and issued strict orders that she was not to be touched by any white man. This protection was fragile and could be revoked at any moment, but for now it held. Elijah had met Ruth 6 years earlier at a Christmas gathering, when Master Thornhill had allowed his slaves to visit neighboring plantations. They had talked for 3 hours, discovering shared histories, both born in Africa, both children of skilled craftsmen, both carrying knowledge that whites didn't know they possessed. Over the following years, they had managed to see each other perhaps once a month at church services or during rare social visits between plantations. They had never touched beyond holding hands. They had never been alone together for more than a few minutes, but they had fallen in love anyway, against all odds and all logic. Because hope persists even in the darkest places, they had talked seriously about escape. Ruth had access to information from conversations she overheard in the big house at Riverside. She knew about the Underground Railroad, about abolitionists who moved through Mississippi disguised as merchants, about safe houses in Tennessee run by Quakers who believed slavery was sin. Elijah had the skills to forge documents. He could read and write, taught by his father in secret, and his metalworking abilities included engraving. They had discussed routes north, crossing points on the Ohio River, the dangers of slave catchers and bloodhounds, and the Fugitive Slave Act that meant even reaching the north didn't guarantee safety. But running was a death sentence if you failed. If captured, male runaways were typically whipped nearly to death, sometimes castrated, sometimes sold to even worse situations in the Deep South sugar plantations or New Orleans slave markets. Female runaways faced the same whipping plus sexual assault as additional punishment. And if you ran, everyone you left behind paid the price. Extra work, reduced rations, increased surveillance. Running was an act of ultimate selfishness or ultimate courage, depending on perspective. So they had waited, planning, watching for the perfect opportunity that never seemed to come. And then March of 1856 arrived, and with it, Nathaniel Blackwood's obscene proposal. The day had started normally. Elijah rose before dawn, as he did every day. In the cabin, he shared with 7 others, an elderly couple who had been at Thornhill for 40 years, a young family with 3 children, and a teenager who worked in the stables. He ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush and headed to the forge as the sky lightened from black to grey. The work that day involved repairing tools broken during fieldwork, hoe blades that had struck rocks, plough points that had bent against roots, the endless maintenance required to keep the plantation machine functioning. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, Nathaniel Blackwood arrived at the forge. This was unusual. The overseer typically avoided the forge, as he did all skilled work areas, preferring to focus his attention on the fields where most of the plantation's labor occurred. Elijah continued working, hammer ringing against hot iron, but every sense heightened. Visits from Blackwood were never good news. "Stop that noise and listen to me," Nathaniel commanded. Elijah set down his hammer and turned to face the overseer. Years of survival had taught him to school his face into blankness, to make his body language submissive without being obsequious. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the forge floor, a deliberate act of disrespect. "You're a healthy buck, ain't you?" Strong, good teeth, no signs of disease? Yes, sir. How old are you now? 34 years old, sir. Never been married, have you? No jumping the broom with any of the wenches here? Elijah's heart began to pound, but he kept his expression neutral. No, sir, that's gonna change. Nathaniel smiled, revealing brown teeth. My niece Abigail needs a husband. You're gonna marry her. The words made no sense at first. Elijah's mind struggled to process them. Sir? You heard me, boy. Abigail, she's my sister's girl, lives with me since her mama died. She's a good Christian woman, works hard, but she's got a condition. Nathaniel paused, enjoying the moment. She's a dwarf, little thing, barely 4 feet tall. No white man'll have her, which is a goddamn shame because she's got good blood and a decent face. But that's how it is. Elijah said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Now I could just let her live out her days as a spinster, but that ain't right. She deserves a husband, children if God wills it. And I've been thinking about who might suit. Nathaniel walked closer, invading Elijah's space. You're smart for a Negro, I'll give you that. Best blacksmith in 3 counties. Probably got decent breeding stock in you, considering your size. And you ain't got any choice in the matter, so you won't give her grief about her condition, like a white man might. Dulian, the full horror of the proposal crystallized. This wasn't about Abigail's happiness or Elijah's preferences. This was about power, about demonstrating absolute control over every aspect of enslaved people's lives, down to choosing who they would share a bed with. This was about humiliation as sport. Sir, Don't interrupt me, boy. Nathaniel's hand moved to the whip on his belt. Now, I know you niggers got your own attachments and such. Don't care. You work on this plantation. You belong to Master Thornhill, and I manage you for him. If I say you're gonna marry my niece, you're gonna marry my niece. Understood? Sir, Elijah's mind raced, searching for any argument that might work. I know I'm just property, sir, but there's a woman at Riverside Plantation, Ruth. I've been seeing her at church these past years, and Nathaniel's laugh cut him off like a knife. Seeing her. Boy, you don't see anybody. You don't have relationships. You don't have preferences. You're a hammer, and I'm the hand that swings you, and you'll strike where I aim you. But, sir, but nothing. Nathaniel's voice dropped to something dangerous. Now, I'm going to give you a choice, which is more than most overseers would do. You can accept this marriage like a sensible Negro and make the best of it. Abigail ain't a bad woman. She'll cook for you, mend your clothes, give you a decent home life within the quarters, or... He paused for effect. You can refuse, and if you refuse, I'll have that old Negro woman Esther who works in the kitchen whipped until she can't stand. That's your mother, ain't she? The one Master Thornhill was kind enough to keep when he bought you. The threat landed like a physical blow. Esther was 63 years old, her back already destroyed by decades of labor. A severe whipping would kill her. So what's it gonna be, boy? You gonna do right by my niece, or you gonna let your old mama suffer for your stubbornness? Elijah looked at the overseer's face and saw nothing but certainty there. This wasn't a bluff. Nathaniel Blackwood would absolutely order an elderly woman whipped to death to prove a point. And Cornelius Thornhill would approve, because property that didn't obey needed to be corrected. I'll marry her, sir. That's what I thought. Nathaniel smiled again. Wedding'll be in 2 weeks. I'll have the preacher come do it proper. You'll move into a cabin with Abigail. I'm having one of the quarters fixed up special. You'll continue your work at the forge during the day, but you'll be her husband at night. That means children, you understand? I expect her to be with child within 6 months. You're a smart Negro. I'm sure you know how to make that happen. Yes, sir. Good. Now get back to work. And boy? Nathaniel turned back at the forge door. Don't even think about running. I got dogs that love the taste of Negro meat, and I'll personally oversee your castration before I let the dogs finish you. Clear? "Yes, sir." Nathaniel Blackwood walked away, whistling a cheerful tune, leaving Elijah alone with the roaring forge and the sound of his own heart breaking. The hammer felt heavy in Elijah's hand. For one long moment he imagined throwing it, imagined the satisfying crunch it would make against the back of Nathaniel Blackwood's skull, imagined the blood and brain matter that would spill onto Mississippi dirt. The fantasy was so vivid, he could almost see it happening. But he didn't throw the hammer. He turned back to the anvil and resumed working, each strike of metal on metal, now carrying a fury that hadn't been there before. The iron glowed orange and yellow and white under his hands, yielding to his hammer, taking the shape he demanded. Iron could be controlled. Iron could be forged into anything. Iron could be made into weapons. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This was real. These scenes played out in thousands of variations across the American South. Enslaved people had no bodily autonomy, no right to choose their partners, no protection against any violation their owners wished to inflict. Forced marriages, forced breeding, forced separations, all legal, all common, all justified by the evil fiction that some humans weren't fully human. That night Elijah made his way through the darkness, to the woods beyond the cotton fields, to the clearing where hush harbor services were sometimes held. He needed to think. He needed to pray, though he wasn't sure to what or whom. He needed to stand under the stars that his father had told him were the same stars that shone over Africa, connecting past and present across an ocean of suffering. Ruth found him there an hour later. She had somehow heard the news. Information traveled fast through the network of enslaved people who communicated across plantations, passing messages through drivers who visited neighboring properties, through vendors who sold goods from farm to farm, through the mysterious channels that oppressed people always develop. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, their hands touching in the darkness. "I heard," she finally said. "I didn't have a choice. I know." They stood in silence for long minutes. An owl hooted somewhere in the trees. A breeze rustled through the cotton plants, making them whisper like ghosts. "We could still run," Ruth said quietly. "Before the wedding. Tonight even." Elijah had been thinking the same thing. "They'll kill my mother. Whip her to death to punish me, and they'll catch us anyway. Nathaniel has bloodhounds. We wouldn't make it 10 miles. Then we fight." "Fight? Fight how? With what? Against how many?" "I don't know." Ruth's voice broke. I can't accept this. I can't accept that we'll never be together because some evil man decided to use you as a joke." Elijah pulled her close, the first time they had ever truly embraced. She fit against him perfectly, and the rightness of it made the situation even more unbearable. "I'll find a way," he whispered into her hair. "I swear to you I'll find a way. This isn't over." "What way? How?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. But standing there in the darkness, holding the woman he loved and couldn't have, Elijah made a decision, not about resistance, not about escape, about something else entirely, about justice. The wedding took place on April 7th, 1856, on a Sunday afternoon after church services. The preacher who conducted the ceremony was Reverend Thomas Whitfield, a portly man who saw no contradiction between preaching Christian love on Sunday mornings and owning 12 enslaved people on his farm outside Woodville. He read the standard ceremony, with slight modifications for slave marriages, carefully omitting the phrase, "till death do us part," because slave marriages had no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by a master's whim. Abigail Blackwood wore a simple white dress that hung oddly on her small frame. She had tried to look pretty, her hair arranged carefully, her face scrubbed clean. She looked terrified and hopeful in equal measure. A 22-year-old woman who had never been chosen by anyone and now was being forced on someone who didn't want her. Elijah wore clean clothes, the best he had, and maintained a mask of calm acceptance while internally cataloguing everything and everyone present. Master Cornelius Thornhill attended, as did his wife Prudence, both considering the ceremony a curiosity worth observing. Several other local planters had been invited to witness the spectacle. They stood around smirking, making jokes sotto voce about breeding experiments and whether the offspring would be proportional or deformed. Their wives pretended to be scandalized, while clearly entertained by the grotesque novelty of it all. Nathaniel Blackwood stood near the front, beaming like a proud father, apparently seeing no evil in what he was orchestrating. Perhaps he genuinely believed he was doing something kind for his niece. Perhaps he understood perfectly what he was doing and simply didn't care. The result was the same either way. The enslaved people of Thornhill Plantation attended because they were required to, standing in a silent semicircle around the ceremony. Their faces revealed nothing, but Elijah could feel their sympathy and their relief. Better you than me. Only old Esther, his mother, showed emotion, tears running down her weathered face as she watched her son being used as a public humiliation. Ruth was not there. She couldn't be there. It would have been impossible to watch. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Reverend Whitfield intoned. Elijah looked at Abigail. She was trembling, her small hands clutched together. She hadn't chosen this any more than he had. She was a victim too, just a different kind. For a moment he felt pity for her. Then he felt nothing but a cold, calculating assessment. She was Nathaniel Blackwood's niece. She lived in Nathaniel Blackwood's house. She would have access to things, would see things, would know things. She could be useful. "I do," Elijah said. The words felt like ashes in his mouth, but he spoke them clearly enough for everyone to hear. The white spectators laughed and applauded as if they'd witnessed a great triumph of benevolent paternalism rather than a grotesque violation of human dignity. The enslaved people remained silent, witnesses to yet another atrocity they were powerless to prevent. Reverend Whitfield pronounced them husband and wife. Nathaniel Blackwood clapped Elijah on the shoulder with false friendliness. Master Thornhill made a short speech about duty and obedience and the civilizing influence of Christian marriage. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, and the white men shared drinks while Elijah and Abigail stood there like livestock that had been successfully bred. The cabin that had been prepared for them was slightly larger than standard quarters, approximately 16 feet by 16 feet, with an actual wooden floor instead of dirt, a real bed frame instead of just straw pallets, a table and 2 chairs, a fireplace with an iron pot for cooking. By slave quarter standards, it was palatial. By human standards, it was still a shack where 2 people would live under constant surveillance with no privacy and no autonomy. That first night, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her white dress, crying silently. Elijah sat at the table, staring at the wall, his mind 1,000 miles away. "I'm sorry," Abigail finally whispered. "I know you didn't want this. I didn't want it either, not like this." Elijah looked at her. "Then why?" "Because Uncle Nathaniel said I had to. Because I'm 22 years old, and no man will ever choose me, and he said this was my only chance to have a husband and maybe children." She wiped her face. "I know what people say about me. I know what I am, but I'm still a person. I still want things that other women want. I'm in love with someone else." "I know. Uncle Nathaniel told me. He said it didn't matter." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Abigail spoke again. "I won't force you to. We don't have to. Not tonight. Not until you're ready. I'll never be ready. Then we'll figure something out. But please," her voice broke again, "please don't hate me. I didn't ask for this either." Elijah looked at this small woman, trapped by her own circumstances, and made another calculation. Hate was useless. Hate consumed energy better spent elsewhere. And if he was going to survive this, if he was going to find justice, he needed to think strategically. "I don't hate you," he said carefully. "But I can't love you ever. I understand. Your uncle is a monster. Abigail didn't respond for a moment. Then very quietly, yes, he is. That response told Elijah everything he needed to know. Abigail Blackwood might be white, might benefit from the slave system in 1,000 ways, but she also suffered under Nathaniel's brutality in her own fashion. She knew what he was. Perhaps she even hated him. That knowledge might prove useful. "Tell me about him," Elijah said. "Tell me everything." Over the following weeks, a strange relationship developed between Elijah and Abigail. They were not husband and wife in any real sense. They never consummated the marriage, sleeping on opposite sides of the bed like strangers in a boarding house. But they talked. Alone in their cabin at night, away from watching eyes, they developed a partnership born of mutual imprisonment. Abigail told him about her uncle's habits, his routines, his weaknesses. She talked about how he drank heavily every night, often passing out by 9 o'clock, how he had pains in his belly that were getting worse, probably from years of alcohol abuse, how he was paranoid about being poisoned, always making Abigail taste his food first, not trusting anyone, how he kept a ledger documenting every slave he'd ever beaten, every punishment he'd administered, meticulously recording his cruelties like a grocer recording sales. She told him about the big house at Thornhill, its layout, who slept where, when servants were dismissed for the night. She described Master Thornhill's routine, his afternoon naps, his evening bourbon, his habit of taking laudanum to sleep. She mentioned Mistress Prudence's own laudanum addiction, how the woman was barely conscious most days, floating through life in an opium haze. She talked about Solomon the driver, how he reported everything he saw to Nathaniel, how he was hated by other slaves but completely loyal to the system that gave him his small measure of power. In return, Elijah told her about the forge, about his father's knowledge, about the skills that whites saw only as useful labor, but which could be turned to other purposes. He told her about the hidden compartment behind the brick, about the powders and potions and preparations that he had been accumulating for years without quite knowing why. He explained how metals could be poisonous, how arsenic could be mixed into tin, how lead could be incorporated into copper alloys, how these contaminated materials would leach poison slowly into food and water. "You're planning to kill him," Abigail said one night. "It wasn't a question. He's a dead man already," Elijah replied. "He just doesn't know it yet." "And the others? Master Thornhill? Mistress Prudence?" "Everyone who profits from this system, everyone who treats human beings like livestock, everyone who thinks they can force people into marriages, separate families, whip children, and sleep peacefully at night." He looked at her directly. "Does that include you?" Abigail was quiet for a long time. "I've benefited from slavery my whole life. The food I ate, the clothes I wore, the roof over my head, all bought with money made from stealing people's lives. I didn't choose to be born into this world, but I've participated in it. Does that make me guilty?" "Yes." "Then I'm guilty." She met his eyes. "But I'll help you anyway. Because Uncle Nathaniel is a monster. And I've watched him commit horrors since I was 8 years old, and I never did anything to stop him. Maybe helping you is how I start to atone." Or maybe, Elijah thought, but didn't say, "You're just trying to survive like everyone else." But her motivation didn't matter. What mattered was that she could provide information, access, and cover. The plan began to take shape over April and May of 1856. It required patience, preparation, and perfect execution. Rushing would mean failure and death. Moving too slowly risked discovery or changes in circumstances that would make the plan impossible. The timeline needed to be just right. First, Elijah needed to create the weapons, not guns or knives, which would be noticed immediately. Something subtler, something that would kill slowly enough that natural disease would be the assumed cause. He began with tin, a seemingly innocent metal used for cups, plates, and utensils. Pure tin is relatively harmless, but tin alloyed with lead and arsenic becomes a different thing entirely. The arsenic came from mineral deposits in the soil near a creek bed 2 miles from the plantation. Elijah collected it gradually over weeks, explaining to anyone who asked that he was gathering clay for lining the forge. Once collected, he processed it carefully in the forge late at night, grinding the mineral into powder, heating it to extract the poisonous compounds, mixing it with lead and tin in ratios he had memorized from his father's teachings. The result was an alloy that looked and felt like ordinary pewter. You could cast it into plates and cups and utensils that appeared completely normal. But when acidic foods touched these implements, vinegar, tomatoes, citrus, they would leach poison slowly into the meal. Not enough to kill in one sitting, but over weeks and months. Consuming meals daily from these tainted utensils, a person would accumulate enough arsenic and lead to cause severe neurological damage, organ failure, and eventual death. The beauty of the method was its deniability. Arsenic poisoning symptoms mimicked many natural diseases: stomach pains, vomiting, diarrhea, confusion, seizures. Lead poisoning caused brain damage, personality changes, paralysis. Doctors of the era rarely suspected poisoning, especially in wealthy households where foul play seemed unlikely. They would diagnose cholera, apoplexy, consumption, or simply wasting disease and prescribe useless treatments while the victims slowly died. Elijah began forging new kitchenware for the big house in early May. He told Solomon, the driver, that the old utensils were wearing out and needed replacement. Solomon, who understood nothing about metallurgy, approved the project and reported to Master Thornhill that the blacksmith was being productive and diligent. Thornhill himself barely noticed. What did he care what utensils his servants used? Over the course of 6 weeks, Elijah replaced approximately 40 pieces of kitchen and dining ware at the big house: plates, cups, bowls, serving utensils, cooking pots. Some pieces were pure tin, untainted. These were marked with a small scratch on the bottom that only he could identify and were intended for house slaves to use. The contaminated pieces had no mark. They were intended for whites only. Abigail helped by gradually removing old utensils from her uncle's house and replacing them with Elijah's new pieces. She made sure that Nathaniel's personal cup, his dinner plate, and his whiskey flask were all from the poisoned batch. She did the same at the big house, carefully noting which utensils were used by the master and mistress and making sure those were the contaminated ones. By the beginning of July 1856, the trap was fully set. Every meal Master Cornelius Thornhill ate was served on poisoned plates with poisoned utensils. Every drink Mistress Prudence took was from a contaminated cup. Every whiskey shot Nathaniel Blackwood poured came from a tainted flask, and they had no idea. The waiting was the hardest part. Elijah went about his daily work at the forge, hammering iron, repairing tools, appearing completely normal while internal murder was being carried out through chemistry and patience. He saw Ruth occasionally at church services, brief moments where they could exchange glances, but not words. She didn't know the full details of his plan. It was safer that way, but she could see something had changed in him. The resignation was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. In mid-July, Nathaniel Blackwood began showing the first symptoms: stomach pains that he attributed to bad whiskey, headaches that wouldn't go away, irritability even worse than usual, tremors in his hands. He complained constantly, dosing himself with patent medicines and blaming everything on the summer heat. By August, Master Thornhill was showing symptoms too: confusion, difficulty remembering things, sudden outbursts of rage followed by periods of strange calm. His wife thought it was apoplexy, that common affliction of overweight men who drank too much. She increased his laudanum doses. which only made things worse by adding opium poisoning to the mix. Mistress Prudence's own symptoms were harder to distinguish from her usual laudanum-induced fog, but her hands developed tremors, her speech became slurred, and she began having seizures that the house slaves whispered about in fearful tones. The plantation doctor was called in late August. He examined all 3 patients, prescribed bloodletting and calomel, a mercury-based purgative that actually added more poison to their systems, and declared that a mysterious ague was affecting the household. He advised rest, bland foods, and prayer. He never suspected poisoning, because why would he? These were wealthy white people dying slowly in their own homes, surrounded by servants who appeared loyal and devoted. Elijah watched it all unfold with satisfaction that he didn't bother to hide from Abigail. "They're dying like slaves die," he told her one night, "slowly, painfully, without dignity, while everyone around them goes about their business as if it's normal. Justice." "My uncle is suffering," Abigail said quietly. "I should feel bad about that." "Do you?" "No. I feel nothing at all. Is that wrong? I don't know what's right or wrong anymore. I only know what's necessary." By September, Nathaniel Blackwood could barely work. He still tried to oversee the plantation, but his mind was deteriorating rapidly. He forgot names of slaves he'd known for years. He flew into rages over imaginary insults. He hallucinated, seeing threats that didn't exist. Solomon the driver essentially took over daily operations, making decisions and keeping the plantation running, while the overseer slowly lost his mind. Master Thornhill was in even worse shape. He could no longer walk unassisted, his legs having lost strength and coordination. His mind wandered in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he thought it was 20 years earlier, and he was a young man courting Prudence. Sometimes he knew exactly where he was, and screamed in frustration at his failing body. The family physician visited 3 times, prescribed more bloodletting, and suggested that the master's condition might improve with cooler weather. Mistress Prudence had seizures almost daily now, violent convulsions that left her exhausted and confused. Her skin had taken on a greyish pallor. She could keep down only liquids, vomiting up anything solid. She prayed constantly when conscious, convinced that God was testing her faith, never realizing that God had nothing to do with what was happening to her body. The plan was working perfectly, too perfectly. Elijah began to worry that multiple people dying simultaneously might trigger suspicion, even in an era when medical knowledge was primitive. He needed to accelerate some deaths and slow others to make the timing seem more natural. He stopped replacing Nathaniel's whiskey flask, allowing the overseer to drink from an uncontaminated source. The progression of his symptoms slowed, which might make doctors think he was recovering while the others worsened. This would make the final stage more dramatic and less suspicious. In early October, Elijah suggested to Solomon that perhaps Master Thornhill would benefit from chicken broth served in a special invalid's cup, a new one Elijah would forge specifically for this purpose, made of the finest pewter. Solomon, desperate to help his master and secure his own position, agreed enthusiastically. The cup Elijah delivered was pure poison, every molecule saturated with arsenic and lead. The broth served in that cup 3 times daily accelerated Master Thornhill's decline dramatically. October 17th, 1856, dawned cool and clear, autumn finally arriving in Mississippi after a brutal summer. Elijah woke before sunrise, as always, but this morning felt different. He had been watching the progression of symptoms carefully, and his calculations told him that today or tomorrow would be the day. He was right. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, a scream came from Nathaniel Blackwood's house. Elijah was already at the forge, but set down his tools and walked calmly toward the commotion, joining other slaves who were gathering to see what had happened. Nathaniel Blackwood was on the floor of his bedroom, convulsing violently. Foam flecked his lips. His eyes had rolled back in his head. Abigail stood in the corner, her face pale, her hands pressed to her mouth. Solomon had been summoned and was already there, backing away from the dying man in horror. "Get the doctor!" Solomon shouted at a house slave. "Run! Hurry!" But there was no hurry that would help now. Elijah watched as Nathaniel Blackwood, overseer of Thornhill Plantation, torturer of hundreds of human beings, rapist and murderer, and architect of countless atrocities, died on the floor of his bedroom in agony. It took approximately 20 minutes for his body to finish the process. His limbs jerked and twisted, his bowels released. Black blood poured from his mouth and nose. He screamed at one point, a sound of pure animal terror, the sound of a man facing judgment from a power he had never believed in. Then he was still. The doctor arrived an hour later, examined the body, and declared that the overseer had succumbed to apoplexy, likely brought on by the same ague that was affecting Master Thornhill and Mistress Prudence. He prescribed increased bloodletting for the surviving patients and left, collecting his fee of $5 for the house call. Nathaniel Blackwood was buried the next day in a simple ceremony attended by few mourners. His niece Abigail dutifully wept, though whether from genuine grief or relief, no one could say. The enslaved people of Thornhill Plantation maintained expressions of appropriate sadness while internally celebrating. Children who had been whipped by that man's hand, women who had been violated by his authority, men who had been humiliated and broken under his oversight, all of them stood in silent vindication as his corpse was lowered into Mississippi soil. Elijah attended the funeral and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. One down. 3 days after Nathaniel Blackwood's death, Master Thornhill followed him into the grave. The plantation owner had been declining rapidly, his body shutting down system by system. On October 20th, after a night of terrible seizures, he finally died in his sleep, age 53, wealthy and respected, and completely unaware that he had been murdered with elegant precision by a man he owned. His funeral was much more elaborate. White neighbors from neighboring plantations attended, speaking in hushed tones about the tragedy of such a prominent man dying so young. Reverend Whitfield delivered a eulogy praising Cornelius Thornhill's Christian character, his business acumen, his dedication to civilizing the savage races through the divine institution of slavery. Several men wept openly at the loss of such a good friend and noble soul. Elijah attended this funeral too, standing with the other house slaves at the back of the gathering. He listened to the preacher's lies and thought about how history would record Cornelius Thornhill as a gentleman planter, a pillar of his community, a victim of mysterious disease. The truth would die with everyone who knew it, except him. He would carry the truth and take satisfaction in knowing that history was a lie written by the victors. Mistress Prudence Thornhill lasted 4 more days. Her death was perhaps the most agonizing of all, her body racked by seizures so violent that 3 house slaves were required to hold her down to prevent her from injuring herself. She died on October 24th, screaming prayers to a God who did not intervene, begging for mercy that did not come, experiencing in her final hours a fraction of the suffering she had inflicted on others throughout her privileged life. 3 major deaths in 8 days. The white community was understandably alarmed. The doctor was called again, this time bringing a colleague from Natchez to examine the premises and determine whether some environmental factor might be responsible. Bad well water, miasma from the swamps, or perhaps even cholera. The doctors spent an entire day examining everything. They tested the well water, they inspected the meat storage, they examined remaining household members. They collected samples of various substances for analysis, and they found nothing because they didn't know to look for metallic poisoning, And even if they had, the technology to detect trace amounts of arsenic and lead in kitchenware didn't reliably exist in 1856 Mississippi. The final conclusion was that a virulent ague of unknown origin had struck the Thornhill household, likely related to the exceptionally hot summer and the proliferation of mosquitoes in the swamplands. They recommended that all household members be monitored carefully and that the entire big house be fumigated with sulfur smoke to drive out whatever evil vapors might remain. This conclusion was accepted by the white community because it made sense within their understanding of disease. They burned sulfur. They prayed, they buried their dead, and they moved on with life because cotton needed to be picked and money needed to be made, and the world didn't stop turning just because 3 people died. But Elijah wasn't finished. 3 deaths were satisfying, but justice had not yet been fully served. Solomon, the driver, was still alive, still carrying his little whip, still betraying his own people to maintain his fragile position of power. The house slaves who had participated in the oppression, who had reported on others, who had chosen collaboration over solidarity, they were still alive. And there were others who had been part of Nathaniel Blackwood's network of cruelty, visitors who had attended the forced wedding as entertainment, overseers from neighboring plantations who had learned techniques from Nathaniel. The problem was that expanding the death count further would definitely trigger deeper investigation. 3 deaths could be attributed to disease. 7 or 10 would start to look suspicious, even to doctors with limited knowledge. Elijah needed to be selective about additional targets. He chose 4 more. First, Solomon the driver. This traitor had spent 30 years selling out his own people for scraps from the master's table. He had beaten children. He had reported escape attempts. He had testified in court against enslaved people accused of crimes, sending them to the gallows. He deserved what was coming. Second, the family physician, Dr. Edmund Sterling. This man had examined countless enslaved people over his career, declaring them fit for sale despite obvious illness, prescribing brutal treatments like bleeding and purging that killed more often than they cured, and collecting fees for services that amounted to maintenance of human livestock. He had drunk coffee in the Thornhill house many times, always served in the fine cups that Elijah had forged. Third, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, the preacher who had conducted the forced wedding. This supposed man of God owned 12 slaves himself and preached sermons, justifying the institution every Sunday. He had taken tea at the Thornhill house dozens of times, always using the silver-handled cup that had been a particular gift from Mistress Prudence. Fourth, Jonathan Blackwood, Nathaniel's cousin, who served as overseer at neighboring Cedar Grove plantation and who had attended the wedding as a witness and participant in the humiliation. He visited Thornhill frequently, often staying for dinner, always using the guest china that had been replaced in July. Over the following weeks, these 4 men began showing symptoms similar to those that had killed the Thornhill family. Solomon developed tremors and confusion. Dr. Sterling complained of stomach pains and dizziness. Reverend Whitfield had seizures during one Sunday service, collapsing behind his pulpit while preaching about obedience. Jonathan Blackwood became increasingly paranoid and violent at Cedar Grove, accusing slaves of poisoning him, which was both ironic and almost correct. Dr. Sterling died first on November 3, 1856. The official cause was listed as heart failure, which was technically true, though not complete. His colleague from Natchez performed the autopsy and found nothing unusual except general organ deterioration that could be attributed to age and occupational stress. Reverend Whitfield died on November 8th during another seizure, this one fatal. His death was attributed to apoplexy and considered a tragedy by his congregation, who mourned the loss of their spiritual leader without ever knowing that their leader had been a willing participant in evil. Solomon died on November 12th, alone in his small house near the overseer's office. his body found by a field hand the next morning. No one mourned him except the white people who had found him useful. The enslaved people of Thornhill considered his death a blessing and whispered that divine justice had finally caught up with the traitor. Jonathan Blackwood's death was the most dramatic. On November 15th, he became convinced that his slaves were trying to kill him. He armed himself with pistols and a shotgun and barricaded himself in his house at Cedar Grove Plantation. For 2 days, he fired at anyone who approached, black or white, screaming about demons and conspiracies. Finally, on the 3rd day, he died of a massive seizure, his brain so poisoned that it simply ceased functioning. 7 deaths over 4 weeks. The white community was now genuinely terrified. Meetings were held, militias were formed, enslaved people were questioned, sometimes brutally, about whether they knew anything about plots or poisonings. Several were whipped on suspicion alone, their bodies sacrificed to white fear, even though they were innocent. But suspicion never fell on Elijah. Why would it? He was a blacksmith, a skilled slave, recently married to a white man's niece, as close to domesticated and trustworthy as a slave could be. He continued his work at the forge, kept his head down, maintained his mask of submission. Abigail knew, of course. She saw his satisfaction, his careful monitoring of who died and when. She never said anything to anyone, bound to him now by complicity and something that might have been respect or might have been fear. She moved back into her uncle's house after his death, using money he had saved to purchase a small property near Woodville. She offered Elijah his freedom if he wanted it. She couldn't legally free him as she had no ownership rights, but she could help him escape. He refused. "I'm not done yet." "How many more?" "I don't know. I'll know when it's finished." But in truth, the main work was complete. The primary architects of his humiliation were dead. Nathaniel Blackwood had died in agony. Master Thornhill had died confused and afraid. Mistress Prudence had died screaming. The collaborators had followed them into the ground. Justice had been served, slowly and precisely, through the careful application of ancestral knowledge that white people had never respected enough to fear. In late November, Elijah finally went to see Ruth. He found her at a Sunday hush harbor service, standing at the edge of the gathering, singing a spiritual about crossing the Jordan River. When she saw him, she broke away from the group, and they walked into the woods together, far enough from others to speak privately. "I heard what happened at Thornhill," she said. 7 deaths. 10, Elijah corrected. "But who's counting?" Ruth looked at him carefully. "You did this?" "Yes." "How?" He told her everything: the metallurgical poisons, the contaminated utensils, the gradual accumulation of toxins that mimicked disease. He told her about Abigail's complicity, about the patience required, about watching his enemies die slowly while maintaining a mask of innocence. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Finally, "Was it worth it?" "Was it worth it?" Elijah repeated. "They forced me into a fake marriage to humiliate me. They threatened to kill my mother if I refused. They destroyed our chance to be together. They built their wealth on stolen lives and stolen labor and acted like they were doing us a favor. Was killing them worth it? Yes. Every moment of their suffering was worth it. And now, what happens now? Now we run. The investigation will eventually focus on poisoning. They'll examine the kitchenware, maybe find the contamination. I need to be gone before that happens." "When?" "Tonight there's a full moon. We can follow the North Star, use the rivers to throw off dogs. I have money. Abigail gave me some of her uncle's savings. We can pay for passage across the Ohio River, make it to Ohio or Indiana. Find the Underground Railroad conductors. Get to Canada." Ruth looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You killed 10 people, Elijah, 10. Even if they were monsters, even if they deserved it, that changes a person. Are you still the man I fell in love with?" Elijah considered the question honestly. "No, I'm not. The man you loved believed in patience, believed in waiting for the right moment, believed that somehow justice would come naturally. That man died the day Nathaniel Blackwood gave me a choice between accepting humiliation or watching my mother be whipped to death. The person I am now understands that oppressors never stop on their own. They have to be stopped, sometimes violently. I don't know if I can love that person. Then don't. But come with me anyway, because if you stay here, you'll spend the rest of your life as property, serving people who consider you less than human. We can sort out love or not love once we're free. Ruth stood there in the Mississippi woods, moonlight filtering through the trees, weighing her options. Stay in slavery, but relatively safe. Or run with a man who had become a killer, risk death by bloodhounds or slave catchers or exposure, but possibly, just possibly, reach freedom. She made her choice. Tonight, then, I'll meet you at the creek crossing at midnight. They ran that night, November 27th, 1856, following streams and rivers, traveling only at night, hiding during the day in caves and hollow trees and abandoned structures. They had close calls, hearing bloodhounds in the distance, seeing patroller campfires, once passing within 50 yards of a slave catcher camp. But Elijah's preparation served them well. He had forged documents claiming they were free blacks, traveling to visit relatives. He had money to bribe suspicious parties. He had knowledge of poisons that kept bloodhounds at bay when rubbed on their shoes and clothing. They traveled for 3 weeks, covering approximately 200 miles, crossing from Mississippi into Tennessee and then into Kentucky. Near Louisville, they made contact with Underground Railroad conductors, Quaker families who risked everything to move fugitives toward freedom. These people provided shelter, food, and guidance for the next stage of the journey. On December 23, 1856, they crossed the Ohio River into Indiana on a small boat paddled by a conductor named William. The moment they stepped onto free soil, Ruth collapsed in tears. Elijah stood there, looking back at Kentucky and the South beyond, and felt nothing except cold determination. They continued north through Indiana into Michigan, finally crossing into Canada on January 18, 1857. Chatham, Ontario became their new home, a community of several hundred fugitive slaves who had made the same journey. Elijah found work as a blacksmith, his skills respected and valued without the taint of slavery. Ruth found work as a seamstress and eventually as a teacher, helping other fugitives learn to read and write. They married, really married, legally married, in March of 1857, almost exactly 1 year after Nathaniel Blackwood had first proposed the obscene forced union that had triggered everything. They built a small house. They had 3 children over the following years. They lived free. But Elijah never forgot. On the anniversary of the first death every year, he would light a candle and sit alone, remembering Nathaniel Blackwood's screams, Cornelius Thornhill's confusion, Prudence Thornhill's terror. He felt no guilt, none. These people had participated in a system that stole lives, destroyed families, and treated human beings as livestock. They had profited from horror. They had died for their sins, and the world was better for their absence. Back in Mississippi, the investigation into the Thornhill deaths eventually uncovered evidence of metallic poisoning. By then, Elijah was long gone, safely across international borders where the Fugitive Slave Act couldn't touch him. Suspicion fell briefly on various enslaved people at the plantation, but without a clear culprit, and with the main witness, Abigail, claiming ignorance, no charges were filed. The case was officially classified as a mysterious outbreak of toxic exposure, possibly from contaminated well water or environmental factors. The Thornhill plantation was sold to a new owner who implemented slightly better conditions for enslaved people after the scandal. But better was relative. The fundamental evil of slavery continued unchanged, wouldn't end until the Civil War forced the issue, wouldn't truly be addressed until long after everyone involved was dead. The enslaved people of Thornhill whispered about what had happened, passing stories in the hush harbors and across plantation boundaries. The blacksmith who had killed his oppressors became something of a legend, a story told in coded spirituals and careful whispers. Some versions of the tale had him killing 20 people, some had him leading a successful rebellion, some had him captured and executed heroically. The details morphed and changed, but the core remained. One man had said no, had fought back, had made the oppressors pay. Those stories mattered. They gave hope to people who had none. They proved that resistance was possible, that the masters were not invincible, that justice could be claimed even by those the law declared property. The story of Elijah the blacksmith joined the growing oral tradition of slave resistance, tales of poisoners and arsonists and runaways and rebels, stories that slavery's defenders wanted forgotten, but which enslaved people preserved and passed down. Abigail Blackwood lived another 40 years, dying in 1902 at age 68. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in 1856. But in private journals discovered after her death, she wrote extensively about her uncle's cruelty, about the forced marriage, about helping Elijah exact revenge. She expressed no regret. "I watched evil men die," she wrote near the end of her life. "I should feel guilt. I don't. Maybe that makes me evil too, or maybe it just makes me human." Elijah lived until 1906, dying at age 84 in Chatham, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had never known slavery. He told them stories about Africa and his father and the skills that had been passed down through generations. He taught them to read and write and think critically. He never told them exactly what he had done in Mississippi in 1856. But he told them enough that they understood. Sometimes justice requires action, not patience. Sometimes the oppressed must become the oppressor's reckoning. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, fugitives and their descendants, abolitionists, community members. Several speakers praised his metalworking skills, his community service, his dedication to education. No one mentioned that he had killed 10 people in Mississippi 50 years earlier. That secret stayed buried with him, but we remember now. We excavate these stories from the ruins of history, pulling them out of the darkness where they were hidden by people who wanted only sanitized narratives. The story of Elijah the blacksmith is true in its essentials, if not in every detail. Enslaved people did poison their masters. They did use specialized knowledge as weapons. They did resist in countless ways, both large and small. The resistance wasn't always noble or pure or non-violent. How could it be? These were desperate people facing existential oppression, denied every legal avenue of protection or redress. When the law declares you property, when society considers you subhuman, when violence and violation are your daily reality, what is proportionate response? What is justice? The white South wanted enslaved people to be passive, grateful even, accepting their bondage as natural and divinely ordained. When enslaved people resisted violently, whites expressed shock and horror, as if the oppressed had no right to fight back against oppression. But violence was already the foundation of slavery itself. Every moment of bondage was maintained by threat of whip and chain and gun. Enslaved people didn't introduce violence to that system. They redirected violence that had always been there. This doesn't mean we celebrate killing. These stories are complex and troubling and should make us uncomfortable. A man poisoning his oppressors is both victim and perpetrator. A woman helping murder her uncle is both accomplice and prisoner of circumstance. These are not simple heroes or villains. They are humans pushed to extremes by inhuman systems. What we can do is acknowledge the truth. The sanitized history taught in many schools presents slavery as a tragic institution that eventually ended through noble political processes. The reality was much darker and much more resistant. Slavery ended because enslaved people resisted constantly through work slowdowns, tool breaking, escape, rebellion, and yes, violence against their oppressors. The Civil War happened partly because the South feared the Haitian Revolution happening in Mississippi and Alabama, feared that enslaved people would rise up and slaughter masters in their beds. That fear was justified, not because enslaved people were naturally violent, but because oppression creates desperation, and desperate people will do whatever is necessary to be free. The lesson for us today is not that violence is admirable, it's that oppression is intolerable. It's that systems of dehumanization create conditions where extreme resistance becomes rational. It's that if we don't want violent resistance, we must eliminate the oppression that makes violence seem necessary. The legacy of American slavery persists today in mass incarceration, economic inequality, police brutality, systemic racism embedded in every institution. The fight isn't over. The chains are less visible now, but they exist, and modern resistance takes many forms: protests, legislation, education, building alternative systems of power. But sometimes, when we read about people like Elijah the blacksmith, we're reminded that our ancestors understood a truth we sometimes forget. Oppressors never give up power willingly. They have to be forced. Not always violently. There are many forms of force, but forced nonetheless. Moral suasion alone has never ended oppression. Power responds to power. If you're feeling angry right now, you should. These stories should enrage you. They should make you uncomfortable. They should force you to confront the reality that America was built partly on the stolen labor of millions of people who resisted in every way they could, including ways that history tried to erase. Remember Elijah the blacksmith. Remember that enslaved people were not passive victims. Remember that resistance is a tradition as old as oppression itself. Remember that justice delayed indefinitely becomes justice denied. Remember that sometimes throughout history, the oppressed have had to become their own liberation. And remember that the fight continues. Different battlefield, same war. Choose your side. What do you think? Was Elijah's revenge justified? Where is the line between justice and murder when the law itself is unjust? How do we honor resistance without glorifying violence? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions we must ask. Share this story, discuss it, argue about it, make it uncomfortable. That's how we learn, how we grow, how we prevent the horrors of the past from being forgotten and repeated. Never forget, never again, keep fighting.